Yeah.
Okay.
She's not.
Yep.
Yeah, she knows that. Okay. This is somebody you knew when you were young.
Well, I am so glad to see so many people in the library. Sorry it's kind of close quarters. We're not used to a big crowd. Maybe someday we'll add on an extra room for that. So, I know you guys all came to see Cary O'Dell. I will announce him. He's going to talk about his book.
Thank you. Thank you. Librarians. Big hands for librarians. Thank you all for coming out. I'm very excited. I won't keep you too long. I know a lot of you tried to order the book. They are having supply chain issues. The printing is done in England, but if you placed an order on Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com or via the publisher Arcadia, stick with it. They are supposed to be getting more very soon, and they will be shipping. I had 30-some copies here on Monday. I sold out to those greedy people in Salem. I'm sorry. I try to speak loud if you're having trouble hearing. Hi, Carol. If you can't hear me, just yell, "I can't hear you." My mom used to do that to me, and that's okay. So, I did not really grow up in Kinmundy, but my kind of off and on I did, because my mom was born in Kinmundy. My dad grew up in Kinmundy. As a lot of you know, my grandfather, O'Dell, was superintendent of schools for many years, and my grandmother was an English teacher for many, many years. And some of you may have actually had taught by her, so I'll try not to disappoint her or her memory tonight. But anyway, then when my parents retired, my dad retired. I grew up mainly in Galesburg, Illinois. When my parents retired in 1997, they moved down here, and they spent the last 10 years of their lives living in a house here in Kinmundy. They're kind of catty-cornered from the fire station next to Shirley Miller. I think you all know that. So they lived there 10 years until they passed away. Around 2011, my mom had been in the hospital. She had a stroke. She then went to Lakeland up in Effingham for a few weeks, or about a month or so. She came back home. And I came back from where I live in Virginia to help reacclimate her to her house. And a friend of hers, Marceline Amersal, who some of you know, stopped by to visit her. And Marceline, who's a hoot, by the way, mentioned something about, in Louisville, about this overgrown house that I never heard of. And it got me interested. At the time, I was working on a book about the Buckminster Fuller Dome home in Carbondale. That came out 2 years ago. And I thought this overgrown house in Louisville might be an interesting side article, another architectural oddity in southern Illinois. So I thought, I'm going to write an article about that. But then I began delving into the history of the house and Johnny Bob Harrell, and I realized there's a lot more than an article here. So, and then to come find out that Johnny Bob Harrell was still alive and living in Louisville, and he was willing to meet with me the next time I was in the area. So in 2015, I went over and I sat with Johnny Bob Harrell, not in the big Mount Vernon house, but in his home just inside of Louisville, which I'll get to in a minute. And that was the beginning of this book project. And it's now been published. This is the book, Johnny Bob Harrell. Give me the next slide. Some of you know we remember Johnny Bob well. Hello, welcome.
Hello, sorry.
Hi. That's okay.
Can we
That's all right. Some of you know that Johnny
over
Bob.
here, too.
Yeah, there's some chairs over there. That might be more comfy. Yeah. More,
Okay.
Okay. Hello, welcome. Some of you may know this Johnny Bob. Or next slide, please. Or that Johnny Bob. Or next slide, please. That Johnny Bob, which is the one I knew. And that was all of them, because he lived a long and colorful life. He lived to be 99 years old. I'm going to kind of cover the highlights of his life here today, but for the full details, you got to read the book, which I will donate a copy to this library, which has an entire book believe it or not. So probably the only library in the world that has the whole Cary O'Dell collection. But anyway, thank you.
We ordered this one, we just don't have it yet.
Okay, good. Oh, you got it. Okay, good.
We just don't have it yet. It's
Next
still
slide,
on
please.
order.
Johnny Bob, of course, is associated mostly with Louisville, but he was actually born in this town that I can never pronounce. How's it? Xenia? Xenia, thank you.
Like a flower.
Thank you, because I was calling it something else the other day, and they looked at me. I can never pronounce it correctly. He lived there until he was about 2 years old when he and his family moved to Louisville. Next slide, please. And his father was involved in all sorts of auto stuff, auto repair, auto sales. A lot of people thought Johnny Bob was an only child. He was not. He had a younger brother named Eugene, but unfortunately Eugene passed away at about 2.5 years old. So Johnny Bob kind of became a de facto only child. Next slide, please. From the get-go, even as a young man, Johnny Bob was a very ambitious, intelligent, driven individual. He was on his high school basketball team. He was a very good student at Louisville High School. And after his service in World War II, like many men of that time, he returned home, and one of the first things he did was found his own construction firm. and this would eventually become the offices of his construction company. It originally said Harrell and Company on the front, and that building is still standing over in Louisville. I'll show you more pictures of that momentarily. He also diversified into buying up other land, becoming a landlord. He owned several buildings here in Kinmundy at one time. He owned the theater in Farina. He also began drilling for oil on some of the property he owned, and he had great luck. He was always a devout man. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, but his big money maker was these mausoleums. He did not invent this type of burial process, but he knew the man who did. Johnny Bob bought the plans from him and patented them, refined them slightly, and then began to sell them coast to coast. And he made a lot of money for the time off of these plans. This is one in Louisville. He is buried there. His wife is buried there. Vance Comer, a name a lot of you know, is buried there. One of his adult children who passed away is also buried there. There's also one just like this here in Kinmundy, I believe. Next slide, please. This is Johnny Bob and his young family. That is his wife Betty and his eldest son Todd in that picture. Johnny Bob, by the mid to late 50s, was the most successful businessman in Louisville and one of the wealthiest men in southern Illinois. He even had over 100 people on his payroll. He was doing very, very well until one day he was diagnosed with cancer of the lymphatic system. He exploited all the medical possibilities and options he had in southern Illinois. He even attended and went and saw a couple of faith healers. Finally, he made an appointment to go to the Mayo Clinic. The night before he was due to have surgery at the Mayo Clinic, next slide please, Johnny Bob and his wife Betty were staying in a hotel up there adjacent to the Mayo Clinic, one that caters to patients there, and he claimed that the night before his surgery, God visited him in that hotel room. Not only did God visit him, but the devil visited him as well. And for several hours they fought over his health and his soul and his life, with God eventually becoming victorious. Johnny Bob went to the Mayo Clinic the next day and said that he believed he had been healed. They did an examination and the cancer was gone. And there was no record of Johnny Bob ever having surgery at the Mayo Clinic. Additionally, as you know, Johnny Bob lived to be 99 years old. When he got back to Louisville, he wrote down his experience with the help of his pastor friend Vance Comer, one-time minister here at the Methodist Church in Kinmundy, later transferred to Louisville, and he distributed this pamphlet across the country, but mainly here in southern Illinois and the region. God started speaking a lot, and Johnny Bob also started to tour local churches and civic halls and whatnot, relating his story of being miraculously healed. At this time, God began speaking supposedly to Johnny Bob a lot. Next slide, please. He told Johnny Bob to run for local office or state office. So in '59, he threw his hat in the ring to campaign for state senate. His motto was "Put God back in government." This is a business card that Johnny Bob gave me. He had quite a few of them that he handed out as a campaign memento. There was also big billboards just like this that dotted Louisville and the surrounding area during the campaign. He mainly campaigned in southern Illinois, but he did partake in at least one debate up in the Cook County area. Unfortunately, his campaign was not successful, and when the votes were tallied, he finished 5th out of a 6-man race. Johnny Bob later said that even though God told him to run for the office, he never told him he would win, so he didn't feel like he didn't feel disappointed. Next, God also told Johnny Bob to build a house. A very big house on property he owned in Louisville, and the house should be modeled after George Washington's Mount Vernon, only this house is 20% bigger. It is still standing, mostly, over in Louisville. Next slide. This is a slightly more finished view of the home, and I use the word finished loosely because the home was actually never finished. It never had running water in it. It was never wired for electricity. The only access to the second floor was via an external staircase out the back. The only way they ever had electricity was to drag a wire from another building. I'll show you that in a minute. And the first floor never had anything more than a subfloor. They also never had any doors in the doorways, although the doorways were cut out. Next slide, please. Here's a view of the estate. Quite impressive as it was. It's buttressed right up to the edge of Louisville. When I first heard about this house in Marceline, I assumed, oh, it's got to be out in the country someplace. No. You can stand, on a good day, you can stand pretty much at the town square and see the cupola of the house. Next slide, please. I want to draw your attention to, this is the house, but I want to draw your attention to this building. This is a 4-car garage. And above that garage is the small apartment. That is what Johnny Bob and his family, which would eventually include 7 children, lived pretty much for the entire time they lived in Louisville. Johnny Bob later got into a kerfuffle with all the local utilities over one thing or another. I'll get to more of that in a minute, but I want to draw your attention to this. This is a water tower and lookout tower that Johnny Bob created because he had to develop his own water source on the property. And this is a pole barn that housed many of the equipment needed to maintain the lawns and also the 2 airplanes. Johnny Bob had learned to become a pilot during World War II. He always maintained his license, and he at one time owned 2 airplanes that he flew frequently up and down the state. Next, please. This is that garage from the other side. So it looks just like a normal home, but the bottom is garage, the top is apartment. I believe that is Angie Comer standing there because she sent me the picture. Next slide, please. Now, Johnny Bob, along with being in politics and very outspoken and very wealthy, was also very powerful in the church. This is the Methodist Church in Louisville. It's still standing. He was one of the upper officials with it. Vance Comer served for many years as the minister. Johnny Bob often spoke at the weekly service. Mostly he spoke about God, but over time, more and more of his sermons had to do with what he believed to be the encroaching communist menace that was afoot in the country, and specifically in Louisville. And often Johnny Bob would take a step further and go on and name names, specific citizens that he believed were either communist sympathizers or all-out communists. And this did not, of course, sit well with the church or with the locality or whatever. A lot of rumors began flying back and forth. Oh no, let's say, I'm sorry. Oh, that's fine. This is Vance Comer. Some of you may remember him. He lived here and was a minister in Methodist church for very long. That's Angie standing to the side, and that is his wife, Angeline. Next slide, please. Go back 2 slides, I'm sorry. There we go. Johnny Bob became very influential, as I said, in his church, but not everyone liked him or liked the message or the sermons he was giving. So it created a huge division within the church, and legend has it that eventually one Sunday Johnny Bob stood up and said, "I am leaving this church, I am founding my own church. If you believe in me and want to follow me, please follow me out of the building." And story has it that about half the congregation, about 50 people, got up and followed Johnny Bob out of the church. So he established his new church. It was called the Christian Conservative Church. They began worshiping at a small church just outside of Louisville called Cole's Chapel. Vance Comer joined him, and every week they would do a sermon. Vance would do the biblical speech and biblical teaching and lead the hymns, and then Johnny Bob would get up and talk about communism, the evil of communism, the coming Armageddon, the coming failure of our government, etc. Another thing, move a slide ahead, please. One more. Soon after founding the Cole's Church, Johnny Bob invited this gentleman to come and speak for 3 nights. This is a man named Kenneth Goff. In the parlance of today, we would call him a media personality. He was a sometime broadcaster, a preacher, a publisher, a writer. He was also very worried about communism. He was also very, very sexist and racist and anti-Semitic. Next slide, please. These are just some of the brochures that he published over the years. But he and Johnny Bob were kind of cut from the same political cloth. Kenneth Goff invited him. Johnny Bob invited Kenneth to come and speak to his congregation at Cole's Chapel one evening, actually for 3 nights in a row. The first night, Johnny Bob and many of his followers were driving from inside Louisville across the bridge over the Little Wabash to the Cole's Church, and as they started to drive over the bridge, they found hanging off of it an effigy, a stuffed effigy stuffed with hay and newspaper, with swastikas decorating its body, and 3 arrows piercing its chest cavity. Then when they passed that, they drove on to Cole's Church and wanted to begin the Goff speech, but soon after, other cars showed up and began circling the church, honking their horns, squealing their tires, firing BB guns in at the church, at the front door, in through the window, throwing firecrackers, etc., etc. And that would go on, and that was the first night, and as Angie Comer put it, that was the quiet night. The next night, the same thing happened, only this time they ran into this. 3 different burning crosses were staked out in front of the Cole's Church. as Johnny Bob and his followers attempted to go to their church, they found this, and that was soon followed by those same vehicles honking their horns, firing their BB guns, throwing things at the windows, throwing firecrackers in. Someone pulled the fire alarm at some point. Eventually, the fire engines of town showed up with their sirens blazing, and it remains open debate whether those fire engines were dispatched to protect those people in the church or just harass them further. But Johnny Bob and his followers became very concerned, and Johnny Bob said, "We have to leave here right now, but I don't want you going home. Go back to my property. You'll be safe there. Move into this house that I'm building." When Johnny Bob built that house, he never knew why he was exactly building it, why God told him to build it. But he believed this is why. So he told everyone to go back, and that was the first night that Johnny Bob had followers or anyone other than his family sleep on that property. Next slide, please. So Johnny Bob quickly established an indefinite religious retreat on his property. He established a small church inside the large Mount Vernon house. This is him preaching there. Next slide, please. And he invited not only his followers, but any of their friends, any of their relatives who wanted to escape communism and impending doomsday to come and please take up residence on the home. So a lot of people moved into the Mount Vernon house, but it was more than even that house could accommodate. So they began building these series of cabins. And some of them are still standing. They eventually went down on 2 rows of them facing each other, a quarter of a mile at the front part of the property. They also erected a fence to keep out unwanted visitors. They utilized this as a watchtower, and you'll see there is a camper. Some people brought tents and slept in tents on the property. Some brought campers. Many lived in the cabins or in the big house, where they would sleep in sleeping bags on this unfinished floor, often at the far side of the home where the only fireplace and source of heat was, because this all happened in January and February of '61. Next slide, please. Along with welcoming and building the cabins, Johnny Bob erected these bomb shelters on the property, because even though he believed his property would be, God told him his property would be safe from any sort of nuclear annihilation or bombing or communist menace, he still wanted to be safeguarding, so he established these bomb shelters and put provisions in all of them. Next slide, please. Now, by this time, Johnny Bob had done a lot of stuff that was making people very nervous and very angry. He had not yet done anything illegal, but that was about to change. You'll see, Johnny Bob had 5 children by this time, and he had a lot of followers with young children who'd come to live on the property. Johnny Bob became convinced that the local school system was full of debauchery and sin and communism. So he pulled all of the children out of the local school system and established his own school on his property. Vance Comer was instilled as the superintendent of the schools. And even though the truancy laws and school laws in Illinois at that time were kind of fuzzy, Louisville had enough, and Clay County had enough. Next slide, please. This is the courthouse. Just days after Johnny Bob pulled his kids out of school, he began being fined on a daily basis for truancy. He began being charged with contributing to delinquency of a minor by not allowing these children to have proper education. Vance Comer was a very educated man, but he was not a professional teacher, so there was a lot of confusion going on. It drew an awful lot of attention, not just in Louisville and Southern Illinois, but throughout the country. In fact, the Today Show actually covered this story and sent a news crew to do a morning report on it. And ironically, my employer, the Library of Congress today, houses a lot of the old NBC tapes, but I went looking and those broadcasts are sadly gone. That wasn't the only attention Johnny Bob was getting. You can imagine with this huge house and breaking with the church and all this kerfuffle with golf, he was getting a lot of attention. Next slide, please. One of the more notorious newspapers at the time, this is the National Enquirer. That's right, that National Enquirer. They were already in business at that time. This is a January 1961 issue. Or no, I'm sorry, it's March. No, May of 61, that's right. That's actress Terry Moore on the cover. But inside, next slide please, is this article. And you have to forgive, it's a copy of a copy, and you have to forgive my notes on it. But anyway, this article's in it, House of Fear. Rich Johnny Bob built it to escape the end of the world, and he invites you to join him. And this, of course, was distributed nationally, and it got Johnny Bob the biggest audience that he'd ever had. And a lot of people read this article. Next slide, please. One of the people that read it was this young man. This is Dion Gaylord Davis. He was a soldier at that time at Camp Lejeune. Wait, let me back up. He was born in Pennsylvania. He came from a very dysfunctional home life. His dad was abusive and an alcoholic. When you were a young person at that time, if you were a young man, you wouldn't get out of the house, you joined the Army. If you were a young woman, you got married. Well, Dion joined the Army at 17. He was enlisted in Pennsylvania, quickly sent to Camp Lejeune for his military training. Dion is not what you would call the most dedicated soldier. He went AWOL twice, and he found this article in the National Enquirer for the first time when he was AWOL for the third time. He and a buddy left the camp, made their way to Roanoke, Virginia, ironically just down the street from where I live in Culpeper. He saw this National Enquirer article. He and his friend decided that's where they needed to go. They needed to go to Louisville and live at Johnny Bob's estate. There was discrepancy about if he called Johnny Bob or wrote to Johnny Bob, but one way or the other, he arrived at Johnny Bob's. He hitchhiked for a couple days with his buddy. They made their way to Louisville. Next slide, please. That's Johnny Bob and Dion on the steps of the Mount Vernon home. He came with a buddy of his. The buddy only stayed about 2 days. Dion only stayed about a week and a half, surprisingly. Shortly after Dion arrived, information differs about how the military found out that their soldier or their AWOL individual was at the estate. Some say Johnny Bob alerted them. Some say Dion's parents alerted them. Some say that the friend who left eventually had to answer to military police, and said, "Where's your buddy?" And he said Louisville. But anyway, one way or the other, the military and the police came looking for him. They first attempted to negotiate with Johnny Bob and said, "You are harboring a deserter. You need to turn him over to us." Johnny Bob refused. Johnny Bob said that Dion had sought refuge and sanctuary here. He was fleeing communism and debauchery at Camp Lejeune. And besides, Johnny Bob said that his estate was a sovereign state, and the laws of the United States and the U.S. military does not apply to him. Next slide, please. After negotiations broke down, on the morning of August 4th, 1961, at approximately 4 a.m., over 100 U.S. military, FBI, and local and state police stormed the compound of Johnny Bob's. They came in from the front gate. They came in for 3 different entrances. The front gate, where they used a half-track, which is like a tank-type vehicle, to storm the gate. They came in from a side entrance, and they came over the Little Wabash River from behind. They all came either carrying rifles or baseball bats, because a rumor had been spread that Johnny Bob had a gang of attack dogs on the property, and they wanted to be prepared. They had on the back of the half-track sound system, a PA system to announce that you've been surrounded. Come out of cabins, come out, throw yourself on the ground, have your hands up, throw down your weapons. They also had a low-flying airplane flying back and forth over the property with a light, spotlight, casting light because it was 4 o'clock in the morning at this time. Dion Davis was found in a cabin. He said he woke up to noise. By the time he opened his eyes, he had 4 men standing above him, each of them with a rifle pointed down at him. Johnny Bob, originally the plan was to arrest everyone on the property, 18 and above, but they became surprised by how many people were actually on the property. Next slide, please. So they just arrested all the men. This is Dion. He was turned over this was in East St. Louis. He was immediately turned over to military police. After being separated that day in East St. Louis from Johnny Bob, neither Dion or Johnny Bob will ever speak or see each other again for the rest of their lives. Next slide, please. This is Johnny Bob in East St. Louis. They actually stopped to refill on their way from Louisville to East St. Louis, here in Kinmundy, by the way. My Uncle Kent was working at the station that they stopped at. Just one of the many weird coincidences that overlaps with my life over this. But anyway, that is his son Todd to the side. Now Todd is only 14 years old, believe it or not, but he's a very tall young man. They didn't want to arrest anyone under 18, but Todd panicked at one moment because there was such chaos on the grounds, and he lunged at one of the police or soldiers or whatever and grabbed his gun, knocked to the ground, and they decided we're taking him in. But Johnny Bob insisted that Todd be with him throughout the day, and he was. Next slide, please. These are all the men that were arrested that day, that are fit in the picture at least. Here's Todd and Johnny Bob at the front. They're all handcuffed in twos. Next slide, please. This is This was taken in Louisville. These are all the rifles that were and guns that were confiscated on the property. Now, it looks like a lot, but Johnny Bob had a side business of selling sporting rifles through the mail, which was very common at that time. And you can see here are the boxes. So while he had a lot of guns on the property, it doesn't necessarily mean they were with people or loaded or battle ready. But nevertheless, they were all confiscated. Along with being charged with, next, go ahead and do the next slide, please. This is Johnny Bob in St. Louis. He was bailed out after about 24 hours. He and Todd were bailed out about 24 hours after they were arrested. The other men were bailed out about a week later after the property was put up as collateral. This is one of Johnny Bob's subsequent court appearances. He was being charged with a variety of things, harboring a deserter, resisting arrest. He also began being investigated by the IRS and by the U.S. Postal Service because they became very alarmed about the voluminous number of postage and letters and U.S. mail on the property. Next slide, please. After Johnny Bob was released, he partnered with another man, David Stacy, another sort of firebrand, arch-conservative commentator, anti-communist crusader, pretty racist in most of his writings. He wrote this pamphlet called Persecution USA, People in Place, an account of both the founding of the colony, religious colony, and of the raid. It was Johnny Bob's attempt to get the message about what happened to him, his side of the story out. Next slide, please. This is Johnny Bob's attorney. He got very busy over the next few years. Next slide, please. Shortly after the raid, about a month or so, Johnny Bob announced that he was going to leave, he and his colony and his followers were going to leave Louisville. And they were going to relocate to New Mexico, San Fidel, Mexico specifically. The population of San Fidel now is 138, so you can imagine what it was back in the early 60s. In fact, it was so small it wasn't even on a lot of maps at that time. God had supposedly told that's where Johnny Bob needed to relocate to. I think it also helped that the land out there was pretty cheap to buy for the most part. So many of his followers, there was about Angie Garcia, the Comers, were one of the first to be dispatched out there. David K. Stacy also joined them, and about 5 other families from the compound moved out to San Fidel. And Johnny Bob and his family was going to move out very shortly. But first, next slide, please. He had an appointment in Springfield with the IRS, and that was in April of 1963. So this was this is not their car, but they had a car like this. Johnny Bob and his wife and his mother and 4 of his 5 children. His youngest son, Jeb, had just been born and stayed behind in Louisville. Got in the car to go up and make this appointment with the IRS in Springfield. They never showed up for the appointment. 2 days later, their car, similar to this one, was found abandoned outside of Taylorville. When police did an examination, they figured out it was Johnny Bob's car. His followers all panicked and believed that Johnny Bob had been kidnapped either by federal agents or by communist agents, but the local government and local authorities decided no, he was a fugitive running from the law. Next slide, please. And they issued his wanted poster and put out a felon. So this was his wanted poster that was hanging in Louisville, locally, all over southern Illinois, in eastern Missouri, and all the way out to San Fidel. Next slide, please. Not much was heard from Johnny Bob or family for the next 18 months until the morning of December 3rd, 1963, when in downtown Louisville, again very early in the morning, an explosion happened on the town square. Several sticks of dynamites were together, lit, exploded, did multi-million dollars worth of damage, not only to the first businesses here in front, but also the courthouse, which is directly in front of this street. Luckily, nobody was injured. Johnny Bob was on the run. Nobody knew where he was, so they couldn't necessarily pin it on Johnny Bob, but it's indicative that in this article from the Clay Clan Republican, Johnny Bob is mentioned by name in the very first paragraph. One of the reasons they figured Johnny Bob or part of his group or followers were responsible is because the bomb was placed strategically in front of the Morgan hardware store. Mr. and Mrs. Morgan were longtime residents of Louisville and were vocal, loud critics of Johnny Bob, and they feuded a lot in the press with each other, et cetera, et cetera. That the bomb was placed right there seemed to indicate it was Johnny Bob. But to date, no one has ever been arrested or charged with this crime, and thankfully nobody was hurt, and thanks to insurance and whatnot, the Morgans were able to rebuild their store. Next slide, please. Next, our saga takes us to Strawberry, Arkansas. This is a very small town in Arkansas. Population today 302, but back then even smaller, and also not on a lot of maps even from that era. It was a small transient town, and a lot of people came and went through, so no one paid too much attention when this multi-generational family sort of moved in and bought a small home with cash and actually silver coins, and then began building onto it because there were so many of them. And finally, a meter reader kept going by and hearing noises within the home, but never seeing anybody outside. He became concerned that someone was being held captive inside. He alerted the local officials. They came to the property. They investigated one of the cars parked in the property and discovered a receipt in it. And on that receipt was printed John R. Harrell, Louisville, Illinois. Next slide, please. This is when Johnny Bob was arrested. He was posing there under the name Thomas Taylor. He and his family were all residing either in that house in Strawberry or houses nearby. He surrendered without any sort of objection from him, so he surrendered himself calmly once he was confronted by saying, "You're John Harrell, aren't you?" And he said yes, and he maintained that he was the one that needs to be arrested and punished, and that the rest of the people and all of his family members were innocent. Next slide, please. This is just some of the additional publications that jumped in on the Johnny Bob story. This is much more salacious looking on the cover than the story inside, as you can tell. Next slide, please. This is actually, the article is pretty fair-minded and pretty straightforward. Next slide, please. Johnny Bob was expedited back to Southern Illinois and quickly to St. Louis. He was put on trial for a variety of earlier charges, plus now running from the law for 18 months. He really didn't put up much of a defense. He pretty much pled guilty to everything, and he was sentenced to 10 years in jail. His sentence began at the Terre Haute prison here. His family moved up to Marshall. Ironically, I was born in Terre Haute. His family lived in Marshall, so they could visit, which is where my parents lived when I was born. Clearest Hospital was in Terre Haute, so that's how that explains that. Anyway, he spent about 5 years, about half of his sentence at the Terre Haute prison. Next slide, please. And then he was transferred to Leavenworth. I asked Johnny Bob why. According to Johnny Bob, he was asleep in his cell one day. 3 guards came in, picked him up, carried him out, threw him in the back of a van, did not tell him where he was going. Next thing he knew he was at Leavenworth. Johnny Bob had begun teaching a Bible study class at the Terre Haute jail and leading a Sunday sermon. And apparently he became very, very popular. And according to Johnny Bob, this is the only source I have on this information, the warden and the other officials at the Terre Haute jail became concerned that he might weaponize that group. And they had to get him out and put him to a more hardcore facility. That's how he ended up in Leavenworth. Johnny Bob served about half of his 10-year sentence. Next slide, please. And he moved back to Louisville. Now, he had a lot of conditions on him. One was he could never preach again in another church. He could never found a church. He could never fraternize with any of his old followers, which was sometimes kind of difficult because most of them were still living in or around Louisville, but they did do their best to keep their distance from each other. He also had to have a paying job, and most people thought he'd never come back to Louisville because who would hire him? But he was very good friends with John Zink, a man who owns a lot of buildings, even some here, landlord here in Kinmundy. He was good friends with John. John hired him for a time until he could get back on his feet. He and Betty and the children that were still living with them moved back into the garage apartment. And he reconstituted his land as a paramilitary facility for the training of patriots, as he called them, to prepare once again for the encroaching Armageddon, the fall of the U.S. government. He began hosting these freedom festivals. He did it twice a year. He also hosted one in western Michigan, and even went out on the East Coast for a time. And because attendance was free, it became very, very popular for these groups to come in their military fatigues and to conduct classes on the grounds during the week on hand-to-hand combat, surviving bank failure, women's role in the new military or in the new revolution, things like that. Eventually, however, the groups that began to show up were even a little too far to the right and a little extreme even for Johnny Bob. The KKK never showed up, but groups that were very much focused on white supremacy and KKK adjacent. By the time the Oklahoma bombing happened, Johnny Bob knew it was time to pull the plug on the freedom festivals, and he did. Next slide, please. The last 30 years of his life, Johnny Bob moved from the apartment. He and his wife originally lived in this house. This is right behind this house is the Mount Vernon estate. Johnny Bob had owned this building for a very, very long time. It served a lot of service, a lot of things over the years. It was an office for him and his businesses at one time. Later, when he established the school, this was the classroom. It was a home to Todd and his young family for a time, and eventually Johnny Bob. The first time I met Johnny Bob, it was to this house that I came. Only this has since been cleaned up. When I was there, junk was piled all up and down in front, and various cars broken down were parked in front. Next slide, please. That's Johnny Bob. I took that picture. That is Cole's Church behind him. I took that in 2015. I think the second time I went to meet with Johnny Bob. And I said, can you show me where Cole's Church is? And he said, yes. So we drove out. I drove out, and he was in the pasture, and he directed me. And that's Cole's Church, where his first sermons happened after he broke with the Methodist Church. Next slide, please. That's another shot at Cole's Church. It has since been razed. There's some sort of grain business or something right behind it, and they own that land and they razed it. Next, please. That is the Mount Vernon house, circa 2015, but it looks about the same now. I think in prep before I visit, Johnny Bob had got someone to bush hog some, so there's this road that we could drive up. And next slide, please. That's the front of the house. Here you can see the front door, Conservative Christian Church. I originally thought that all of this was a barricade of sort placed there to dissuade vandals and trespassers. But from talking with Todd and Zahn, his other son, no, this is just things that Johnny Bob collected that he thought were valuable and he hung on to. Next slide, please. This is the garage. This is the 4-car garage, and above it is the apartment. I took this that day. That's my rental car right there. And Johnny Bob sat in the car and he gave me free rein to walk all over the property. And it was so strange. I remember looking up in one of these windows and hanging on a hanger on a hook was like a woman's sweater, just hanging there like someone had just been there and had put that aside to wear the next morning. It was so surreal and kind of Twilight Zone, and I remember that. So, next slide, please. This is the back staircase of the Mount Vernon house. This is the only access that the house had to the second floor. And I was not brave enough to go up those steps. Next slide, please. That's the side. There's the stairs there. So this is like most of the windows. I really wanted to look in the windows. I didn't get to most of them. But next slide, please. I did once. You can see my reflection in that. I'm glad I'm not wearing the same shirt tonight. But anyway, and you see me in my camera, but you can also see here stacks and stacks of newsletters. Because when he was doing the Freedom Festivals, he was also running this wide organization, prepping the citizenry for the failure of the government and things like that. So he had this huge, all these newspapers and form letters and things like that. Next slide, please. That's the construction offices. That building, thanks because it's brick, is still standing. Next slide, please. That's the front. Again, you can't get into. You have more junk in front of it. Next slide, please. That's one of the cabins that is actually standing. Some others are not. Dion Davis was discovered in a cabin like this. I believe the Comers lived in a cabin like this for a time until they bought a trailer that they pulled onto the property. Next slide, please. When I was there, these have since been pulled off, the property was just littered with all these broken down, rusted out vehicles and things like that. I tried to count them all. I couldn't keep up. I kept losing track because some were like overgrown with shrubbery and weeds and whatnot. These are the line of cabins here. This is the pole barn that is also, according to Todd, chock full of junk. He believes that the original seats and film projector from the Farina Theater are still in that pole barn because Johnny Bob might need it someday. So anyway, next slide, please. More of the vehicles. I'd asked if these were left over from when people lived at the property, and Todd and others later said no, these were things that his dad bought as investments. So okay, next slide, please. This is the tail end of Johnny Bob's airplane. He owned two at one time. One is still parked on the property, and I'm sure it is not airworthy. So, next slide, please. That's another one of the cabins falling in on itself. Next slide, please. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that's Dion Davis. Dion is living, he's alive and well in Texas. He was returned to the Army. He was honored with, he did get an honorable discharge. He was given the choice of staying in the military or get out. He decided he'd had enough. He got out. He kind of regrets that now. He's a very nice man. He's a very smart man. He has had a variety of jobs over the years. He worked for a carnival for a time. He worked even as a fine artist, but he spent most of his life driving trucks and everything for the oil industry in Texas. He never married. He never had children of his own, but he's married. He's been married for 30 years. He has stepchildren, which he considers his own children. He has step-grandchildren. No one had ever talked. He never talked to his wife or his children about the whole Johnny Bob experience, and no one ever looked him up before I came knocking. But he was very gracious and he was very kind and he said he enjoyed the book. And like I said, he's alive and well in Texas. Johnny Bob, when I told him that I'd reached Dion, wanted to reach out to him. I said, Dion, do you want to talk to Johnny Bob? He did not. So I honored that. And I let him know when Johnny Bob passed away last year. Next slide, please. Oh, and that's the book. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much. Listen, any questions you may have?
How can I get the book, Cary?
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you, Dolores.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. As I said, they're having supply chain issues with the publisher. The printing is done in England, even though it's an American publisher. I don't know why. I had 30 copies sent here to Southern Illinois. I thought it would be enough to last. They sold out on the first night. I wish I had more. I tried to get more on Friday before I flew home to St. Louis. I could not. They sent me everything they had. But if you've ordered on Amazon, on BarnesandNoble.com, or via the publisher Arcadia, bear with them. They will be getting more very soon, and they will be satisfying those orders. Yes, ma'am.
The property and the contents.
Yes.
Is it in the hands of the children?
Yes.
Or do they? What's their plan?
Zahn, who is his middle son, lives over in that town I can't pronounce. Xenia. Thank you. I'm going to take you every place with me just for that. Okay. They are slowly excavating the property. It cannot be repaired. It would cause, the house was never finished, the big house was never finished. I don't think even the garage apartment is livable anymore. It would cost millions of dollars to try to rehab it. It will eventually fall in on itself. do you know John Baylor? He's a local photographer. He lives over in Louisville. I'm working with him and the estate to get him on there. John is a very, very good, almost professional photographer. We want to go on there, send him on there, and he's going to photograph the property from front to back, stem to stern, and then trust those with either the Genealogical Society in Louisville or the local community college or high school or public library, so we have a document of it. But eventually that building will just probably cave in on itself if it is not vandalized. They're having problems with vandals, as you can imagine right now. So, but it is in the hands of the Harrells, and Zahn is slowly. But Zahn is like 70-some years old. You know, when your dad dies at 99, you're not a kid, you know. So he's slowly going through it with the help of his children and grandchildren and things like that. So, and I, by the way, am donating all of my research materials to Gene Bailey at the Genealogical Society in Louisville. So as soon as I get home, I told Gene I would gather all that stuff and send that, because it's more valuable there and of more use there than sitting in my basement. So, yes.
So you said at one time he was the richest man in Southern Illinois, but he had lost all that by the end of his life?
Pretty much, because unlike this, a lot of people ask me, was this a cult? I don't think it was, because usually in cults, the money flows to the leader. In this case, Johnny Bob's money was, he paid a stipend to all those people living on his property. So not only did he pay for all the building of the cabins, and they did contribute to a monthly food allowance or whatever. But Johnny Bob paid all those people a monthly stipend. He also had to be on the run for 18. He also had 7 children. He was also on the run for 18 months. So I never saw his financial statements. The rumor was that the last about 30 years of his life, he subsided mainly on Social Security payments, which is sort of an interesting. ironic twist for a man who rallied against the U.S. government for so long, but that's supposedly what happened. I can tell you, my dealings with it, he did not strike me as a wealthy man at all. And I think that the land that he owns would still be valuable. The property was halved at one time. It was originally 60 acres, and sometime after he came out of prison, they had sold about half of it off. So now it's 30 acres. That would still be valuable, but first you'd have to clean it all up. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What is the Bailey School that Darren Bailey found out? How close is that to this?
The Bailey School?
He has his
Full
Bailey
armor.
School.
It's full armor, it's called.
It's on Route 45.
Oh, at 45. Okay. Yes.
Are a lot of these pictures and things in the book?
Yes.
They
Yes.
are?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
I think almost all of them are.
Okay.
And there's some that you didn't see today.
I can
Yeah.
remember as a child, my parents, we drove to Louisville one
Yeah.
night. I went by, in front, and it was like, it was a scary place to everybody.
It had to be really, that's one of the, it's because it's so close to town,
Yeah.
It had to be scary. Plus, when they lived there, Johnny Bob was every day, and sometimes into the late in the evening, all the men and boys, where he would conduct them in military maneuvers. They were concerned that the town would invade or communists would invade. Think how frightening that would be to be standing there and looking inside and seeing all these guys with real guns
Yeah.
doing these military maneuvers. I think that's why the thing became such a head so quickly, because everybody, it was just so scary. You didn't know what was looking in. They didn't know what, they were scared of people on the outside. Everybody was just so scared.
So is that property now like off limits to anybody? Or
It is,
can
they
you-
have no, there used to be a gate around it, or a fence around it. They took that down. I'm not sure that was the best idea, but they have no trespassing signs up there, yeah.
I didn't
So,
know if people were allowed to.
I don't believe they are. It's private property, and they do have problems with vandals and everything. I think Marceline, I shouldn't say this, I think she broke in, she went on the property all those years ago, and I think with some of these crazy friends of hers, like my mom, and the cop came and chased them off, and I was like, and then I forbid my mom from hanging out with them.
Well, his son Jeb lives in Farina.
Yes,
And
yes.
he has a
Store
furniture store
in Salem, I visit.
yeah.
Yes, Jeb's been wonderful.
Yeah.
In fact, Jeb
Yeah.
attended on Salem on Monday, and I went and he had some additional questions for me, and so I sat and talked with him in his store this morning. He's a very
So,
nice man.
I wonder how old he would have been.
He was a newborn when the family disappeared. He was left behind in Louisville in the care of the housekeeper, and the family, when they were gone for 18 months, Jeb was still in Louisville, kind of left behind, and I think that must be traumatic. He was probably too young to remember it, but that's very strange. They did not take the baby with them.
Would
And
slow him down.
maybe that's what they thought. And I asked Todd once, I said, what was the plan when you were on the run? Because once you went on the run, you're going to have to stay there. You're going to have to stay on the run. You couldn't come back. Were you going to come back and get Jeb? And he said there was no plan. It was really, for a man who planned a lot, I think he just felt panicked and he just fled with the family.
So when you talked to Jeb, did he have good things to say about his parents?
I think, yes. Nobody has bad things to say. And my book is not pro Johnny Bob or anti. I like Johnny Bob on a personal level. I liked him a lot. I thought he was a nice man. I like Deion Davis. I like Todd. I think he's amazing. I don't think anyone had. Deion Davis still harbors some bitterness about his time. Now, he's a very young man. He wasn't there very long, but he harbors some bitterness. Everyone else I talked to who lived on that property, or with the children of the people who lived on that property, do not have anything bad to say about Johnny Bob. It's also indicative that I'm aware of no lawsuits against Johnny Bob for abuse or embezzlement or any sort of thing like that.
So is this Dion, is he still living?
Oh yes, he lives in Texas.
Okay.
He's a very nice man. He's retired now. He, like I said, he spent most of the years working as a truck driver. Then for a while, he was during the school year, he was driving a school bus. And he's been married for 30 years, and he has these children that he considers his own. They're not his, they're stepchildren, but he's been in their lives for 30 years, so he considers them his step-grandchildren. But he's a very nice man. He's a very nice, and a very learned man, so. Yes, ma'am.
In your dealings with Johnny Bob, did he express any regret? Did he
I think he
was
still
wrong?
felt very persecuted. The one thing that he was very vocal, he knows he should not have fled from the law at that time. He knew that really, he may have been able to go, none of the other men that were arrested that morning served any sentence at all. They were tried, they were found guilty, but most were given everybody was given suspended sentences. Johnny Bob might have got the same, but instead he ran, and he found out very quickly that was not, again, he felt very persecuted. He felt it was unfair, and the raid that day probably was overkill. I mean, Angie Garcia, who I have tremendous respect for, incredible perspective and well-balanced view of everything that happens. She said it took her about 20 years before she could even talk about the morning of the raid. One day she's sleeping in her bed, next thing you know, noise and people kicking in doors and things like that. Those cabins didn't even have locks on the doors, so the idea that people were kicking them in was overkill. But then again, they didn't know what they were getting into. And there was all these rumors that he had this huge arsenal, he had these guard dogs, God knows what else. So they had to go in. So I think Johnny Bob felt very persecuted. He probably did not think he was going to get a fair trial. And that's why he panicked and grabbed most of his family and went on the run. But later on he said, I regret doing that. But other than that, I think he still felt very mistreated and persecuted for a lot of things. Anybody else?
I had heard that perhaps he had artillery on that.
On that,
Did you
I wouldn't be
get a reference
surprised.
to that?
I wouldn't be surprised. There was a lot of rumors. There was a rumor that there was, I never heard about artillery, but there was a lot of guns and a lot of weapons. And some of them did have them at their bedside because they had to be alarmed. But as you saw, a lot of them were still in boxes in the house and things like that. The press often portrayed Johnny Bob in a very, they like to take their digs at him a lot. Case in point, the day of the raid, he was found, the big house, the Mount Vernon house, was built over another house had been. The basement was still there. So they built the big house over this basement. The morning of the raid, Johnny Bob was found in that basement. Okay. The first report said Johnny Bob Harrell was found in the basement. The next day, the report said Johnny Bob Harrell was found cowering in the basement. The next day, Johnny Bob was found hiding in the basement. I mean, it got worse and worse as we went on, in a way to kind of paint Johnny Bob. Very interesting, people have asked, is this a cult? A man named Dean Garrett, who we are not related to, believe it or not. He's unfortunately passed away. He wrote a very good thesis about Johnny Bob many years ago, and he theorized in it that the press and locals began calling it a cult to make the place seem much more sinister than it actually was. And I think there's some truth to that. I'm not an expert on cults, but based on what I've seen about cults, and I've watched all the documentaries, The Wild Country, all that, it wasn't a cult because so often cults make people give up so much. Their names, they change their hair, they have to wear specific costumes, things like that. Johnny, if you were Bob on the outside, you were Bob on the inside. He didn't care. You pretty much could come and go as you please. And some people did leave. The population on the grounds fluctuated a lot. At one time, there's probably close to 100 people living there. By the time the raid happened, it was half that. But people would come, they would stay for a week, 2 weeks, maybe they had to go back to their lives, their jobs, maybe they found this wasn't what they wanted, and they left after 2 days or something like that. But that's not a cult. Usually once you get in a cult, you never get out, So I don't think it was a cult, if that wasn't your question. But I never found any artillery, but there was a lot of rumors. There was rumors that there was a tunnel underneath the house. Maybe you all heard that. That went from underneath the house to the bottom of the courthouse. First of all, that'd be a long tunnel because that's like half a mile. And it doesn't make any sense because why would Johnny Bob want to be in the courthouse? He was trying to get out of the courthouse. So that happened because when Johnny Bob had to put in his own water system, he had to get a backhoe in and dig and dig and dig. And so that, you can almost hear the rumors. I can almost hear the playground rumors and the kids. They talked about it nonstop. This is only the highlights of the Johnny Bob story. There's a lot more in the book. Somebody had a question.
Did he have more than one of those bunkers?
Yes. I don't know how many he had, but I think there was at least 4 or 5. I saw Angie Garcia, that's Angie Como, that's married, came over, and she and I were talking about them again. And she came up to my talk at Flora earlier today, and I was so happy to meet her in person. I think there was 4 or 5, and she told a funny story. They were all told, put in there whatever you think you need, and you don't, So she took in M&Ms and her paper dolls. She thought that's what she needed. So those have since caved in. I think that also gave rise to the whole tunnel idea.
I think one of the things that people forget, the McCarthy trials were mid-50s.
Yes.
People were buying bomb shelters left and right.
This was not uncommon.
This was not, There was a lot of strange stuff, but
Yeah, lots
there
of
was a
stuff,
lot
yes.
of.
A lot of people had provisions in their basements. A lot of people had bomb shelters. A lot of people were worried about communist menace. I don't know how many they thought it was going to start in Louisville, but they were worried about it. You know, and then that happened after 9/11. A lot of people started buying things and sticking them in their basement. It wasn't necessarily. Johnny Bob maybe took it a step or two more, but yeah, no, a lot of this was quite common at that time.
So what was the timeline exactly again, from when it's all started until?
Johnny Bob started building the house in 1959.
59?
Okay, and the Dion arrived in 1961, early 60. Dion wasn't there very long, but the National Enquirer article was May of 61. The raid happened in August of 61. So that was a very tight time. That's one of the things that's very interesting here is we're not talking a span of years or months. We're talking weeks and sometimes just days. You know, a lot of people find out Dion was only there for like a week and a half before the military came looking for, demanding that he return. So it's a very quick timeline that happened.
When did it with the Kinmundy Methodist Church? When did all that with Comer?
It's in the book, but
It's
Comer
about-
had departed Kinmundy.
Was it
gone to
like
Windsor.
mid? Was it about?
It would have to be in like the mid-50s, I would guess. Yeah, mid-50s.
So the boy that was with Dion,
Yes.
did he
He
get
was
imprisoned also?
nobody could agree on what his name was, and there's no records. I follow a lot of record requests and Freedom of Information Acts, and no one would ever agree on his name. They do remember that his parents were from Memphis, and about 2 days after he was on the property, they drove up in a very fancy new car. They all remembered the car. Nobody remembered his boy's name, but they all remembered the car, and gathered him up and took him back to Memphis.
So he
Dion
was
never
AWOL
saw him.
also, right?
He was AWOL, yes. He was a friend of Gion's from, he'd gone AWOL with Dion, and they finally made their way to Roanoke. And they even had a job, they lived in a boarding house there for a while. They even had a few jobs there while they were AWOL. He worked in an ice cream truck, and I forgot what Dion did, but some sort of like labor type job and things like that. Until they saw that National Enquirer article and decided that's where we need to be. But the other man, a lot of people say it was maybe John Young, which is problematic because it's kind of a common name. I went looking for him. I couldn't find him. When you don't have a name, it's really tough. Yeah. So nobody knows what happened to him, other than his parents came and got him and took him back to Memphis. He would have eventually answered to somebody because he was AWOL. Yeah, yeah. But Dion never had any contact with him either, and Dion couldn't even remember his name. So Dion had a very interesting life right after that. A lot of people said, "How are you honorably discharged when you've gone AWOL 3 times and caused all this?" He was briefly. He was in a military prison briefly. He was also in the psych ward, a military psych ward for a time. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic at one time, but that was a very common diagnosis for a plethora of mental illnesses. He was finally ruled by the military court that he had a mental defect, but it pre-existed his time in the military. So they were not responsible for it, and he was not necessarily responsible for it. And he was given the option, you can be either honorably discharged or you can stay in the Army. And Dion wanted out at that time. He says now, I wish I had stayed because he needed the discipline and he needed that. Eventually he had to be returned to Louisville because he was facing charges in Louisville. And I recount all that in the book. And it was only, he said, an impassioned plea from his mother that kept him from being put in jail here in Illinois. But I go into that. And he's a fascinating man. And like I said, a very learned man. I was very impressed with him. Anybody else? I go into much more detail in the book, so as soon as I hope you get it soon. I hope you enjoy it. I was very honored today because I never talked with Kathy, Johnny Bob's youngest daughter. And I always worried what she would think and what I'll think. But I met her today. She works in Flora, and she read the book and she thought it was very fair and very accurate. So I was very happy with it. So, and I wanted to create a fair book and separate all the fiction, the tunnels, and all the stuff from what actually was the reality of it. So that's what I tried to do.
So most of the children stayed around here?
Almost all the children have stayed this way. 2 of the children died in adulthood. His eldest daughter I've never spoken to. She lives in northern Indiana. And Kathy, his youngest, I'd never spoken. I spoke to her once very briefly, about 5 years ago. And I gave her my number and I said, if you want to call me back and talk, I'm happy. These people are under no obligation to talk to me. And if they don't want to talk, I understand. I totally understand. I'm just very grateful that Todd and Zahn and Jeb and Angie and Dion were so forthcoming, and some of the other people I talked to. Todd is retired now. Again, these kids are 70 or plus. He lives in southern Indiana. Jeb lives in Farina but works in Salem. Zahn lives in
Xenia.
Xenia, thank you. And Alfie used to be the county clerk or something with the city of Florida. Those are his 7 children. Like I said, 2 passed away in adulthood. 1 is buried in the mausoleum in Louisville. So Johnny Bob outlived 2 of his own children.
So did they all kind of feel like that you were going to tell the story as it happened?
I guess so.
And they didn't try to sway you?
No,
anyway?
I think they were all pretty accurate about it. I think I don't know why they didn't know me from Adam, and I kept thinking if someone came to me and said, "Cary, I'm writing a book about your dad," I'd be like, "Huh? Who are you?" So I'm not sure I'd be that gracious, or that trusting, but they were. So maybe they got a good feeling from me. I think also they lived such a strange life that a total stranger, even one from Kinmundy or with ties to Kinmundy, came to them to talk to him. That's not that strange to them. I think when you've lived through all this, Cary O'Dell coming knocking, that's not strange. So hopefully they were very impressed when I found Dion, and because he was a very vital part of the story. They were all very, very forthcoming. And I think I first spoke with Todd, and Todd was the main get, so to speak, because he lived through all this, and he was an adult. Jeb hadn't even been born when a lot of this happened. And I think once Todd, I passed the Todd test, they were happy to talk. Kathy didn't want to, that's fine, like I said. And I met her today, and she was really lovely, and I was very touched that she liked the book. And she found it fair. So I was afraid she'd come in mad. But I think it's a fair book. It's not pro Johnny. I like Johnny Bob on a personal level. I really did. I liked him as a man. I did. I thought when I met him he'd be all like fire and brimstone and stuff. He wasn't. He was because he was 91 when I met him. So he was pretty mellow. He's always showed great concern for me. He always asked if I had a basement in my house. I said yes. He said, "Do you have some provisions down there in case?" And I said, "Yes, sir." "And how close are you to D.C.?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm about an hour away." And he said, "Well, that's good." And he was always very concerned about me. He was always very curious about my ties to Kinmundy and stuff like that. So I thought he was a very sweet man. Thank you all for coming out. And this is a wonderful library, and I'm a library snob. This is a nice
Thank you.
You
I
should
will
be very
say-
proud of Kinmundy for having a library this nice.
I will say for anybody that doesn't have their book yet, like me, we did print out some bookmarks if you want Mr. Odell's autograph.
Oh, yes, I'm happy.
You
Yes,
can autograph the back of your bookmark. You can stick it in your book when you do get it.
yes, I'm happy to do
We
that.
also have some cookies and some water over there. Feel free.
I was
to have
baking
anything you
all
like.
night.
Uh-oh.